Good morning. Thanks for joining us today. My name's Jim Dewar, preaching guy with the Astoria Christian Church here in Astoria, Oregon, and we are back on West Irving Avenue, just down the street from where we filmed last week, because I just kind of love that view of the bridge down there. I've admired it from way up high here a couple different times. And today, I want to talk to you about beating bitterness. In 2008, Charles Chapman was released from prison. 27 years prior to that, at the age of 20, he had been convicted of rape. He maintained his innocence the entire time he was in prison. He refused parole several different times because parole would mean admitting he had done the deed. And finally, in 2008, he was exonerated because of a DNA test. The woman had misidentified him, and he was released. Imagine that. 27 years in prison for a crime you did not commit, and nobody was willing to believe you. He was quoted in an interview, not surprisingly, saying, "I'm bitter." Can't blame him. Several years ago, my dad died. We had been estranged for about 10 years. I was not notified that he had passed away. I was not included in the obituary. If you read the obituary, you would never know he had a son named James. I was not invited to the funeral. I was not involved in the funeral. I did not even know where he was buried. Something like that happens to you, it is fertile soil, isn't it? For toxic roots, for toxic plants, for toxic bushes, for toxic trees, for a whole toxic forest to grow and just take over your heart and your life and your mind and your present and your future. How about you? Any wounds like that? Any injustices that you've experienced? Undisputed, legitimate instance where someone has wronged you and there's nothing you can do about it? If that's been your experience, well, today's message is for you. Today we're going to take a look at one Bible character and see how he handled the roots of bitterness that could have taken root in his life. Joseph's story begins in the Old Testament book of Genesis, beginning in chapter 37. And as we are introduced to Joseph, we learn that he's 17 years old. He's his father Jacob's favorite son because he was born in his old age to his favorite wife. Jacob had several wives who bore children, which became the tribe and then the nation of Israel. But at the age of 17, Joseph was essentially daddy's snitch. The other brothers didn't really like him because they knew he was the favorite. His father had given him a coat of many colors. If you're familiar with the Bible at all, I'm sure you've had that story read to you if you were a little kid. It was one of my favorite stories to read. You might remember Donny Osmond's amazing Technicolor dream coat. Well, it was called a dream coat because Joseph did have some dreams. He had a dream where all of his brothers had sheaves of wheat or grain, and they all bowed down to his. And he was stupid enough to tell them this dream. That's just not really smart. And they're like, "Do you think you're going to rule over us?" And yeah, he did, because that's what the dream said. He had another dream where the sun, the moon, and 11 stars all bow down to him. And he tells his dad that dream. And his dad says, "Do you think we're all going to bow down to you and your whole family?" So that was how we are introduced to Joseph. Now, every good story has good turns and bad turns. That's why we love stories. That's why we love movies and novels and plays. You know, what's going to happen to the character? Joseph is no different. He has 3 different bad turns with a corresponding good turn. In chapter 37, we read that he is sold into slavery. Dad has sent him to go find his brothers. They're taking care of the sheep somewhere. He's got to find them. And when they see him, they know what he's up to. He's there to report on them. So they decide to kill him. And you thought your family was dysfunctional. But then they talk about it and say, you know, why kill him when we can make some money? So they throw him in a pit, and they decide to sell him to some traders who are on their way down to the country of Egypt. And this is what they do. And they take his coat of many colors from Daddy, and they dip it in goat's blood, and they send it back to Dad. And they say, something must have happened to your favorite son, Dad. Sorry. And of course, Jacob grieves, and he thinks that his son has been eaten by a wild animal, and he'll never see him again. Well, this is where the good turn comes in. Sold into slavery into Egypt, the good turn is he ends up at the household of this guy named Potiphar, who is the captain of the guard for Pharaoh, who's kind of like the king of Egypt. And we're told that everything he did prospered, and Potiphar puts him in charge of his entire house, and everything Joseph touched had success, and God blessed Potiphar's house because Joseph was in there. So that's the first bad turn, and then a good turn. So here comes another bad turn. Joseph's second bad turn comes in chapter 39, where he is imprisoned on false rape charges, just like Charles Chapman we talked about at the beginning. Turns out that Potiphar's wife had, as Donald Miller said, unmet needs, and she sought to satisfy those needs with Joseph. And so day after day she would bug him and say, Jojo, come to bed with me. And he was like, I can't, because I serve God. How could I do this thing and sin against God? He says, my master has withheld nothing from me. I have complete run of the house, except you, because you're his wife. He refused to do this thing. So finally she got so desperate, and she chased him around the house. She rips off his cloak, and he runs out of Potiphar's estate, apparently fairly in a state of undress, and she accuses him of rape. And so he ends up in prison for doing the right thing. Potiphar believes his wife, so Joseph has what you call a bad turn. Now here comes the good turn. When he gets down to prison, guess what? The prison warden sees the potential in him, sees what a leader he is, sees what a capable administrator he is, puts him in charge of the whole prison, and he has success in the prison, and God blessed him in the prison. Which brings us to the third bad turn, chapter 40. He gets forgotten by a friend that he had helped. Turns out that while Joseph was in prison, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker were also in jail. They had done unspecified offenses against Pharaoh, and they each have dreams. And Joseph is pretty good at interpreting dreams. He gives the credit to God, but he tells them what's going to happen. Tells the cupbearer, in 3 days you're going to get reinstated to your old position, serving wine to Pharaoh, which Donald Miller says sounds like a pretty cake job. He tells the baker, in 3 days you're gonna be executed. And that's what happens. And so before the cupbearer goes back to his old job, Joseph tells him, look, let Pharaoh know I didn't do anything wrong, and I was sold into prison, and I really shouldn't be here. Would you put in a word for me with your boss? And the cupbearer says, I got your back, buddy. That is what I will do. Except for 2 years, he never even thought about Joseph, apparently, until one night Pharaoh has a couple of really bad dreams, and he calls all his wise men, his spiritual counselors, his astrologers, all the people that are supposedly capable of interpreting dreams, and no one has a clue what these dreams mean. And the cupbearer says, there's this guy in prison named Joey, and he interpreted my dream. Remember when you were mad at me and you killed the baker, but you brought me back? This guy told me that was going to happen 3 days before it happened. And Pharaoh says, well, bring him up. Let's talk to him. Joseph comes up, listens to the Pharaoh's dreams, and says, all right, here's the deal. For 7 years, you're going to have bumper crops in Egypt. I mean, you're going to have more grain than you know what to do with. But the next 7 years, you're going to have a famine. So for the first 7 years, you got to sock away as much grain as you can to get your country through the next 7 years. And Pharaoh says, I like it. I like it. Wonder where I can get someone to manage a program like that. And he says, Joseph, you're my guy. And so Joseph, here comes the good turn. Although he's forgotten by his friend in prison for 2 years, now he is promoted to what is essentially considered to be the role of prime minister. He's second in command to Pharaoh. He's Everyone's bowing down to him. He's got his own chariot, and he goes all around the country overseeing the accumulation of this huge bumper crop that they had for 7 years. And then, of course, when the next 7 years come, Egypt has plenty of grain, so much grain, in fact, that they're able to sell it to their neighboring countries at staggering prices and basically bankrupting their neighbors, but giving them some grain. And Joseph is responsible for all of that. So you would think that this was it. Joseph's dreams have been fulfilled. He's the prime minister of Egypt. He's got wealth. He's got power. He's a high government official. He's got complete success. But God has higher ambitions than just a high government position for Joseph in Egypt. Because of this famine, his family, back in the land of Canaan, they're hungry, they have no access to food, and they hear, hey, there's food down in Egypt, and we got to go down there and make an appointment with this Egyptian guy. By now, Joseph's name had been changed to an Egyptian name, so his brothers go down to Egypt to negotiate how they can get some food during this time of famine. But they fail to recognize Joseph. He doesn't look the same now. He's dressed as an Egyptian. He's got a completely different accent, a completely different name, but he recognizes them. And we're not going to go into all the drama behind that, but you want to read there in the book of Genesis. It's fascinating, the interplay between Joseph and when he recognizes that his brothers have come down. And the ironic thing is they have to bow down to him because now he's the prime minister of Egypt. But God was working. He had more than just Joseph's political ambitions here. He was ultimately sparing this family from Canaan, helping them to survive so that eventually he could bring the Savior of the world through this very dysfunctional family's line. Jesus Christ came out of this family that Joseph was responsible for saving. It's a pretty cool story. Now, somewhere in this story, and we're not told exactly where or when or how, Joseph was able to jettison, to dispose of, to get rid of his bitterness, because he's human. You know he's got to be feeling, every time I turn around, I'm getting a raw deal from people that I've trusted and I expected more from. Yet somewhere in there, he's able to see God's bigger picture at work in his life. Somewhere in there, he renounces his claim for justice. And this is nowhere more clearly seen than in chapter 50, where his dad dies. Joseph gets permission from Pharaoh to take his brothers back to the land of Canaan and fulfill Jacob's wish to be buried back to the land of Canaan. And that goes well. And they come back to Egypt, because Joseph still had a job as prime minister down there. And as they're coming back, the brothers are like, okay, Dad's dead now. Joseph still hasn't said anything about the way we mistreated him, throwing him in the pit, lying to Dad about his death. I bet you now he's going to get his revenge. This is it. Retribution's coming. As soon as we get back down there to Egypt, man, we're toast. And so they beg Joseph, and they confess, look, we know what we did was wrong. Please forgive us. And Joseph utters in chapter 50, verse 20, some of the most powerful words in the entire Bible regarding personal bitterness and the sovereignty of God. He says, you intended all that you did to harm me, but God intended it for good. God was saving many lives. And he wasn't just talking about the physical lives. Spiritually, we know, as I just mentioned, God was bringing about the saving of the spiritual condition of the world through Jesus Christ in many more 100 years. Powerful, powerful passage. Genesis chapter 50, verse 20. Good memory verse. What you intended to me for harm, God intended for good. There's no lecture. There's no threats. There's no talk about revenge. There's no talk about payback. He doesn't recite all the past offenses that they have done to him. As you read through that account, it goes on to say Joseph spoke kindly to them, and he promised to care for them and their families. Wow. Can you speak kindly to those who are responsible for causing the most pain in your life? Could you promise to care for them? Powerful stuff going on here. Here's the question. Are you able to see God's hand when you're hurt, when you're victimized, when you're disappointed? Do you want to see God's hand? Because let's face it, a lot of us, we love our anger. We love our self-righteousness. We love our self-justification. We love replaying all the hurts that someone has done to us. And it's kind of like rubbing your tongue over a sore tooth. It hurts, but it feels good in a really bizarre kind of way. And if we're honest, some of us don't want to get rid of our pain. We don't know what our life would be like to live without that level of anger. But if you're able to do that, to let that go, and it's not easy, it is a sign of spiritual maturity. Remember, the only thing God's ever wanted, Old Testament and New Testament, is a people who reflect his character. And what Joseph is doing here is reflecting the character of God, who just happens to be in the forgiving business. So, let me ask you, have you been falsely accused? Have you been mistreated? Has your integrity been questioned? Have you done the right thing and then suffered unjustly because of it? Ever been betrayed? Ever been lied to? Someone let you down? Someone disappointed you? Maybe even your church. It's astounding how many people I run across. Some of you probably watching this, you're watching it because you're not going to go near a church, but you're still kind of interested in what the church has to say. And the number of people who have been hurt by churches is astonishing to me. Maybe it was a church leader. Maybe it was a church fight. Maybe it was sexual abuse. Maybe it was emotional abuse. Churches can be pretty nasty places. I have to be honest. Maybe it was a church member. But have you had this kind of hurt? If so, guess what? You're in good company, because so did Joseph and so did Jesus. So don't wallow in, oh, woe is me, God, let me down. No, you're experiencing the same thing that God's greatest characters and God himself in the person of Jesus and God himself in the person of God experienced. For example, Philippians chapter 2. Take a listen to this passage. Philippians chapter 2, beginning at verse 5. See how this idea of humbling and then God coming through and exalting. That's what happened to Joseph. The Apostle Paul, in what is considered an ancient hymn of the church, same thing that happened to Jesus. And I would suggest the pattern is probably pretty close to what needs to happen in your life and in my life. In your relationship with one another, Paul says, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Therefore, verse 9, God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. Exaltation only comes after the humbling, and the humbling can be very, very painful. And if you fail to see this, then you're never going to see the good that God wants to come out of your situation. If you fail to see that you've first got to be humbled before God can bring the good out of the situation, you're going to miss what God could do out of your pain. About 40 years ago, Kim and I were in a youth ministry in Balmer, Maryland. And Russ and Betty Burgett, one of the sweetest couples we've ever met, shared with us a poem that meant a lot to them. And I have this taped inside one of my Bibles, and I have referred to it very often my whole span of ministry. You've probably heard this before. It's called "My Life is But a Weaving." The author is unknown. My life is but a weaving between my Lord and me. I cannot choose the colors. He knows what they should be. Ofttimes he weaveth sorrow, and I in foolish pride forget he sees the upper, and I the underside. Not till the loom is silent and the shuttles cease to fly shall God unroll the canvas and explain the reason why. The dark threads are as needful in the weaver's skillful hand as the threads of gold and silver in the pattern he has planned. He knows, he loves, he cares. Nothing this truth can dim. He gives his very best to those who leave the choice with him. If you adopt this mindset, you'll be in a position to where God will bless you and others. You'll be in a position to be in sync with what God is up to in the world. It's your choice. You can choose to wallow in self-pity, and you can be bitter and foul and empty and joyless and, quite frankly, toxic to yourself and everyone that has the misfavor of being close to you. Or like Joseph and Jesus, you can choose to trust God. And you can choose to say, you intended this for harm, but God intended it for good. Remember Charles Chapman? Guy got released from prison after 27 years, exonerated by DNA. He's out of prison, and apparently he's devoted his life to helping other prisoners get exonerated who have been wrongly convicted. But there's a danger. The danger is that if he doesn't manage his bitterness, he's going to end up back in another prison, a self-made prison of bitterness, where a lot of people live. It's a danger for him. It's a danger for you. It's a danger for me. Several months after my dad died, I got a letter from an attorney explaining in legalese why my dad had taken the steps he had where I was concerned. It was painful to read. I think my dad intended that. It was ugly. It was mean. And we had a fire pit that night. And I went out and I burned it. Because I didn't want to risk letting that ugly letter whisper poison into my soul in my vulnerable moments. There are times, aren't there, when you just kind of want to go back and replay all those painful moments and just have yourself a really good pity party. And I thought, if that letter is lying around here, I'm going to pull it out every once in a while. And it's not going to do any good to anyone. That doesn't mean that I have forgotten. I'll never forget. What it means is I don't obsess on it. It doesn't consume me all the time. It crosses my mind once in a while. think about it, let it go, and move on. What it means is that I'm still looking for God's hand in all of it, and I'm still looking to see where God's blessing is. How can God take this painful experience and bless me? And how can I take this painful experience and maybe God, through my experience, bless other people? It's a much healthier way to look at the painful things that have happened in your life. I remember hearing the story about Clara Barton, who founded the Red Cross, and she had an encounter with a person who had hurt her viciously years earlier, and she was very gracious towards that person and acted as if nothing had happened. And one of her associates, after that encounter, said, "Don't you remember what they did to you?" And Clara Barton said, "No, as a matter of fact, I don't. I distinctly remember forgetting that." I love that. I distinctly remember forgetting that. What a positive, healthy way to live. So what do you need to distinctly remember forgetting in your past, in your life? When I have preached this in churches before, I'll bring an old window up front and I will have given everyone a Post-it note and invite them to write down one word that represents this painful experience from their life. One word. Maybe it's a name, maybe it's a date, maybe it's an address, maybe it's a place, maybe it's a conversation. Write down what succinctly represents what you need to let go of. And then I invite the people to come up at the end of the church and just put it on the window. And I call it looking through the 50-20 window. It's a new perspective. I'm going to look at my pain in a different way. And it's been powerful for the people that have participated in that. Obviously on video like this, we can't do that. But I would recommend that maybe you still go ahead and take a piece of paper and write that one thing down that is threatening to imprison you, or maybe already has imprisoned you. And then pray with Joseph and Jesus. God, change my perspective on this. Turn this into something that will be good for people. Hey again, thanks for joining us today. My name is Jim Dewar, preaching guy with the Astoria Christian Church. Looking out through the pine trees at the bridge over to Washington. It's just beautiful up here on West Irving Avenue. Have deer walking right in front of us. A 4-point buck just crossed the street a bit ago. It's just a beautiful little town. Our church is located at 1151 Harrison Avenue, and if you're in the area, we'd love to have you join us 10:30 on Sunday mornings. You can check out my videos on YouTube. Just Google Jim Dewar. Our church Facebook page, Astoria Christian Church, AstoriaChristian.org if you want to go to our website and see what we've got going on there. But we're just glad that you spent some time with us this morning. And this week, just set yourself free. If some bitterness has got a hold of you, do yourself a favor, do your family a favor, do everyone in your world a favor, do God a favor. Let it go. Just let it go. Just give it to God and look for the good that He wants to bring out of it. It's the only choice. It's your only choice. Just do it.
I closed my eyes, drew back the curtain to see for certain what I thought I knew. Far, far away, someone was weeping, but the world was sleeping. Any dream will do. I wore my coat with golden lining, bright colors shining, wonderful and new. And in the east, the dawn was breaking, and the world was waking. Any dream will do. to the